Each encounter holds a hidden truth. Every investigation demands clarity. Empowering your legal rights, uncovering pure justice.
Turn around, now! You fit the description and I'm not arguing about it.
Sir, I've done nothing wrong. You can verify my identity through dispatch.
Don't start talking like you're above this. I know what I'm looking at.
You're looking at a federal judge.
I don't care who you claim to be. Turn around!
The handcuffs click shut around her wrists at 9:47 p.m. Judge Claudia Brennan, a federal district court judge with 17 years on the bench, stood in the fluorescent glow of a gas station parking lot, arms pulled behind her back, while Officer Dennis Kovac told her to stop resisting. She wasn't resisting. She was asking questions, and apparently that was enough. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity. This wasn't a misunderstanding that would get cleared up in 5 minutes. This was a veteran police officer looking at a black woman in business attire pumping gas and deciding she must be a criminal. What happened next would trigger a Department of Justice investigation, destroy multiple careers, and send a clear message about what happens when you handcuff a federal judge for absolutely no reason. The gas station sat on the corner of Westfield Avenue and Route 22, one of those brightly lit spots that stays open all night, serving coffee and lottery tickets to whoever needs them. Judge Brennan had stopped there after working late at the courthouse, reviewing case files for a complex fraud trial set to begin the following week. She wore a navy blue suit, her judicial robes long since hung up in her chambers. Her car, a silver sedan, sat at pump number 4. Officer Kovac pulled into the gas station at 9:43 p.m., 4 minutes before everything went sideways. He was responding to a call about a stolen vehicle in the area. The description was minimal. A dark-colored sedan, possibly silver or gray, occupied by a black female. No plate number, no make or model, no distinguishing features. Just those few details broadcast over the radio 20 minutes earlier. Kovac scanned the gas station and saw Judge Brennan's vehicle. Silver sedan, black woman. In his mind, that was probable cause. He didn't run the plates. He didn't call for backup. He didn't observe any suspicious behavior. He simply decided this must be his suspect and approached with his hand already resting on his duty weapon. Judge Brennan noticed the patrol car but thought nothing of it. Police stopped at this station regularly. She finished pumping her gas, replaced the nozzle, and was reaching for her receipt when Kovac's voice cut through the night air. He ordered her to step away from the vehicle and put her hands where he could see them. She turned, confused. The officer was standing 15 feet away, positioned behind his open car door, hand still on his weapon. Judge Brennan asked what the problem was. Simple question, reasonable under the circumstances. Kovac's response was to repeat his command, louder this time, telling her this was her last warning before he considered her non-compliant. Here's what Judge Brennan did next, and pay attention because this part matters. She calmly stated her name and title. She explained she was a federal judge returning home from work. She offered to show identification. She suggested the officer verify her identity through dispatch. She kept her hands visible. Her voice remained steady. Everything she did was textbook de-escalation. Kovac heard none of it. Or rather, he heard it and decided it was a lie. In his mind, criminals claim to be anything when confronted. Doctor, lawyer, judge, whatever might get them out of trouble. The more insistent she became about her identity, the more convinced he grew that she was lying. He told her to turn around and place her hands behind her back. Judge Brennan asked to speak with a supervisor. Kovac said she could do that at the station. She asked what crime she was suspected of committing. Kovac said she matched the description of a suspect. She asked what description. He told her to stop talking and comply. The gas station security cameras captured everything. The footage would later become Exhibit A in multiple investigations. It showed Judge Brennan standing completely still, hands raised to shoulder height, while Kovac approached from behind. It showed him pulling her arms down roughly. It showed the handcuffs going on. It showed her being walked to the patrol car, while other customers watched in stunned silence. A man filling up his truck at the next pump called out, asking if everything was all right. Kovac told him to mind his business. A teenager working the register inside came to the door, phone already out and recording. Kovac didn't stop him, but his jaw tightened when he noticed. Judge Brennan was placed in the back of the patrol car at 9:51 p.m. 4 minutes from first contact to arrest. 4 minutes to destroy a career and trigger a federal civil rights investigation. The back seat smelled like industrial cleaner trying to mask something worse. The plastic seat was cracked and uncomfortable. Judge Brennan sat perfectly upright, staring straight ahead, her mind already working through what would happen next. She had sentenced people from her bench for civil rights violations. She had written opinions on unlawful detention and qualified immunity. She had lectured at law schools about Fourth Amendment protections. And now she was experiencing the other side of the system, handcuffed in a police car because an officer saw her skin color before he saw anything else. Kovac climbed into the driver's seat and picked up his radio. He reported that he had detained a suspect matching the description of the stolen vehicle call. Dispatch asked if he had confirmed the vehicle was stolen. Kovac said he was transporting the suspect to the station for processing. Dispatch asked again about the vehicle confirmation. Kovac didn't answer. The drive to the station took 8 minutes. Judge Brennan didn't speak. Kovac didn't either. The radio crackled with routine traffic. Another unit responding to a noise complaint. Someone requesting a tow truck. The mundane business of a Tuesday night, while a federal judge sat handcuffed in the back, her credentials sitting in her purse, her judicial ID in her wallet, all of it ignored. They arrived at the station at 10:03 p.m. Kovac walked Judge Brennan inside through the side entrance used for processing arrests. The booking area was busy with the usual evening chaos. 2 officers finishing paperwork. A woman arguing with someone on her phone. A man sleeping on a bench, apparently waiting for someone. Nobody looked twice at Kovac bringing in another arrest. The officer working the booking desk was named Sergeant Phyllis Dunham. She had 22 years on the force and had processed thousands of arrests. She was the first person that night who actually listened. When Kovac explained he had arrested a woman matching the description of a stolen vehicle suspect, Dunham asked to see the vehicle report. Kovac handed it over. Dunham read it slowly. Then she looked at Judge Brennan, still standing there in handcuffs, wearing a business suit that probably cost more than Dunham made in a week. Something didn't add up. Dunham asked Kovac if he had confirmed the vehicle was actually stolen. He said he was bringing the suspect in for questioning first. Dunham asked if he had run the plates. The silence that followed answered her question. She turned to Judge Brennan and asked for her name. Judge Brennan provided it, along with her title. Dunham's eyes widened slightly. She asked if Judge Brennan had identification. The response was yes, in her purse, which was still in her vehicle back at the gas station. Dunham looked at Kovac with an expression that clearly communicated what she thought of his police work. Dunham excused herself and walked directly to the watch commander's office. Lieutenant Victor Salazar was finishing reports when Dunham knocked. The conversation that followed lasted less than 2 minutes, but Salazar's face went through several distinct phases. Confusion, disbelief, anger. The kind of anger that comes from knowing your department is about to be destroyed in the press and the courts. Salazar came down to the booking area personally. He looked at Judge Brennan, still in handcuffs. He looked at Kovac, still convinced he'd done solid police work. Salazar asked one question. Did you confirm anything before making this arrest? Kovac started to explain his reasoning, but Salazar cut him off. The handcuffs came off Judge Brennan's wrists at 10:18 p.m., 31 minutes after they went on. Salazar apologized repeatedly while Dunham documented everything. Judge Brennan remained composed, but her first request made everyone in that booking area go silent. She wanted every piece of documentation related to her detention. Every report. Every radio communication. Every camera angle from the gas station and the police station. She wanted names, badge numbers, and the chain of command notifications. Salazar knew exactly what that meant. This wasn't going away quietly. Judge Brennan made one phone call from the station. Not to a lawyer, though she was one herself. Not to family. She called the chief judge of the federal district court, Margaret Holloway, who had appointed her to the bench 6 years earlier. The call lasted 90 seconds. Holloway's only response was a quiet, "I see," followed by, "Document everything. I'll handle the rest." By midnight, 3 things happened simultaneously. The Department of Justice received formal notification of a federal judge's unlawful detention. The state attorney general's office got a courtesy heads-up that something significant was brewing. And the police chief, Raymond Foster, got woken up at home by a phone call that made him seriously consider early retirement. Foster arrived at the station at 12:40 a.m., wearing sweatpants and a department jacket. His first stop was Lieutenant Salazar's office, where he watched the gas station security footage. Then, the dash cam from Kovac's cruiser. Then, the body cam that Kovac apparently forgot he was wearing. Each video made Foster's expression darker. The facts were undeniable. Kovac had no reasonable suspicion. The vehicle wasn't stolen. The plates came back clean. Judge Brennan identified herself immediately. She offered her credentials. She asked for a supervisor. She complied with every command despite having zero legal obligation to do so. And Kovac arrested her anyway because in his mind, a black woman in an expensive car at night must be a criminal. Foster called Kovac into the office. The officer still thought he might get praised for being proactive. Instead, Foster suspended him on the spot. Badge and weapons surrendered immediately. Kovac started to argue, to explain his reasoning, but Foster wasn't interested. He'd seen enough officers destroy their careers through stupidity, but this was exceptional, even by those standards. Judge Brennan left the station at 1:15 a.m. She drove herself home in the same vehicle Kovac claimed was suspicious. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. She didn't speak to the press waiting outside, didn't make a statement, just walked to her car with the same composed dignity she'd maintained throughout the entire ordeal. But composed didn't mean she was letting this go. Not even close. The next morning, Judge Brennan did something she'd never done in 6 years on the bench. She recused herself from every case on her docket for the next 2 weeks. Her clerk made the notifications. Lawyers scrambled to adjust. Other judges absorbed her cases. The legal community started asking questions. By noon, the story broke. Not because Judge Brennan leaked it. She didn't have to. Someone at the station talked. Then someone else. Then the gas station owner who'd watched the whole thing reviewed his security footage and decided the public needed to see what he saw. The footage hit social media before any official statement came out. The response was immediate and volcanic. Civil rights organizations issued statements. The State Bar Association expressed concern. Other federal judges, who normally stayed out of public controversies, made it known they were watching closely. Legal scholars wrote op-eds about judicial independence and police overreach. The story wasn't just local anymore. It was national. The police department tried damage control. They issued a statement about taking the matter seriously and conducting a thorough investigation. The words rang hollow. Everyone knew what the investigation would find because everyone had seen the videos. Kovac, sitting at home on suspension, still didn't fully grasp what he'd done. He told friends he was being thrown under the bus for political reasons, that he'd followed procedure, that anyone would have made the same call. He genuinely believed he was the victim here, punished for doing his job, in a world where police couldn't win no matter what they did. Meanwhile, Judge Brennan was building her case. Not in court yet. That would come. First, she documented everything. She wrote a detailed timeline from memory while it was fresh. She compiled every interaction, every statement, every moment from pulling into that gas station to walking out of the police station. Her legal training meant she knew exactly what mattered and what didn't. She also did something unexpected. She requested records of every traffic stop Kovac had made in the past 3 years. Public records, nothing requiring a warrant or subpoena. Just data that any citizen could access with the right request forms. The department had to comply. The patterns that emerged were damning. Kovac stopped black drivers at rates far exceeding his peers. His stops of black women specifically were off the charts. Most stops resulted in warnings or nothing at all, suggesting they lacked legitimate basis from the start. Several had generated complaints that went nowhere because they were marked unsubstantiated or unfounded. Judge Brennan wasn't the first person Kovac had done this to. She was just the first one with the resources, knowledge, and platform to do something about it. 2 weeks after the arrest, Judge Brennan filed a federal civil rights lawsuit. Not just against Kovac, against the Department for inadequate training and supervision, against the city for policies that enabled this behavior, against everyone in the chain of command who'd seen Kovac's pattern and done nothing. The complaint was devastating. 43 pages of facts, legal theory, and documented evidence. It detailed not just what happened to Judge Brennan, but the systemic failures that made it possible. It included data showing Kovac's stop patterns. It referenced the complaints that were ignored. It outlined how supervisors failed to identify obvious problems. The legal community read it with something approaching awe. This wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a masterclass in federal civil rights litigation, written by someone who understood both sides of the bench. Judge Brennan had essentially written a blueprint for how these cases should be prosecuted. The city attorney read the complaint and immediately advised the mayor to settle. The case was unwinnable. The evidence was overwhelming. Taking it to trial meant putting Kovac on the stand, where he'd get destroyed on cross-examination. It meant the videos playing for a jury. It meant discovery that would expose every other problematic officer and policy the department had. But the mayor hesitated. Settling immediately looked like an admission of guilt. It looked weak. He wanted to fight, to defend the department, to show he supported law enforcement. The city attorney warned him this was a catastrophic miscalculation, but the mayor thought he knew better. That decision would haunt him. Judge Brennan's legal team, which now included 3 civil rights attorneys working pro bono, filed motion after motion. They requested everything: personnel files, training records, internal affairs investigations, use of force reports. They built a case that went far beyond one illegal arrest. They were going after the entire culture that made it possible. Discovery revealed things the department desperately didn't want public. Kovac had been flagged multiple times by supervisors for concerning behavior. Nothing was ever done. Other officers had complained about his aggressive approach. They were told to mind their business. Training on implicit bias was outdated and rarely enforced. The early warning system designed to catch problem officers was essentially ignored. The deeper the investigation went, the worse it got. This wasn't about one bad cop. It was about a department that enabled bad cops and ignored warning signs until something exactly like this happened. Judge Brennan watched it unfold with the same calm she'd shown in that gas station. She wasn't angry anymore. Anger was temporary and unproductive. She was focused, determined. She'd spent years on the bench seeing cases where people claimed police misconduct and struggled to prove it. Now she was on the other side, and she understood exactly how the system failed victims. She was going to make sure that system couldn't fail anyone else the same way. 6 months into litigation, the department's lawyers made their first serious mistake. During a deposition, they put forward Captain Vincent Cross, Kovac's direct supervisor, thinking he'd defend the department's training and oversight. Instead, under oath, Cross admitted he'd personally witnessed Kovac make questionable stops, but never filed formal reports because he didn't want to create paperwork that might hurt the officer's career. Judge Brennan's attorney let that statement hang in the air for a full 10 seconds before asking the next question. The deposition transcript read like a prosecution's dream. Cross had essentially admitted the department prioritized protecting officers over accountability. He'd seen problems and actively chose to hide them. When asked why, his answer was worse than silence. He said, "That's just how things worked. That everyone understood you didn't throw fellow officers under the bus over minor issues." Minor issues. That's what he called racially biased stops. The mayor received that transcript on a Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, he was ready to settle. But Judge Brennan had a different plan. She didn't want money. She wanted change. Her settlement demands included a complete overhaul of the department's early warning system, mandatory bias training every 6 months, body camera footage review protocols, an independent oversight committee with subpoena power, and policy changes that required supervisors to document and investigate any pattern of complaints against officers. The city balked. Those demands would cost millions to implement and fundamentally alter how the department operated. Judge Brennan's response was simple: take it or see you in court, where a jury will award me twice what this costs and mandate the same changes anyway. She was right, and everyone knew it. A jury would see the videos, hear about Kovac's history, learn about the complaints that were ignored, and come back with a verdict that would devastate the city's budget and reputation, far worse than accepting these terms. 3 weeks of negotiations followed. The city tried to water down every demand. Judge Brennan refused to budge on the substantive changes, though she agreed to extend implementation timelines to make them financially feasible. She also agreed to a monetary settlement that was surprisingly modest, just enough to cover her legal fees and compensate for the violation she'd endured. This wasn't about getting rich. It was about making sure this couldn't happen to someone without her resources and knowledge. The settlement was announced on a Tuesday morning. The press conference was packed with reporters, civil rights advocates, and community members who'd been following the case. Judge Brennan stood at the podium, composed and precise as always, and explained what had been achieved. She talked about systemic change, accountability, and the responsibility of those in power to use it wisely. She never mentioned Kovac by name. She didn't need to. Everyone knew this case was bigger than one officer. Kovac himself had been fired 4 months earlier, right after Cross's deposition made headlines. The department announced his termination with a brief statement about conduct unbecoming an officer. No details, no admission of wrongdoing. Just a quiet exit that let them pretend they'd handled the problem internally. But the personnel file told a different story. Kovac was fired not just for the arrest of Judge Brennan, but for the pattern of behavior that arrest exposed. Internal Affairs had finally done the investigation they should have done years earlier. They'd found everything Judge Brennan's lawyers had found: discriminatory stops, ignored complaints, warning signs that were never addressed. Kovac couldn't even fight the termination. His own body camera footage had destroyed any defense he might have mounted. His union rep took one look at the evidence and advised him to accept the firing and move on. There would be no arbitration, no appeal, no getting his job back. He was done in law enforcement forever. Some officers in the department were furious about the settlement. They saw it as the city throwing one of their own under the bus to appease activists. They complained the new policies would make it impossible to do their jobs, that they'd be second-guessed on every decision, that the oversight committee was just a witch hunt waiting to happen. But other officers, the ones who'd been doing their jobs correctly all along, welcomed the changes. They were tired of officers like Kovac making everyone look bad. They were tired of dealing with community distrust created by a few bad actors who never faced consequences. They understood that accountability protected good officers by weeding out bad ones. The implementation of the settlement terms took 18 months. The Oversight Committee was the most contentious piece. The department fought every aspect of its structure, trying to limit its authority and access. Judge Brennan's legal team threatened to go back to court multiple times before the committee finally launched with real power to investigate and make binding recommendations. The committee's first major action sent shockwaves through the department. They reviewed 3 years of body camera footage and identified 12 officers with concerning patterns. Not illegal necessarily, but problematic. Disproportionate stops of minorities, aggressive language, unnecessary escalation. These officers were flagged for additional training and closer supervision. 2 were eventually terminated after investigation revealed policy violations. The message was clear. The old way of doing things was over. But the real test came when the committee investigated a use of force incident that the department had already cleared as justified. An officer had tased a teenager during a traffic stop. The internal review found no policy violations. The committee disagreed. They looked at the full context, the officer's history, the lack of de-escalation attempts, and concluded the force was unnecessary. They recommended discipline. The police union exploded. This was exactly what they'd feared. Outside civilians overruling trained officers and tactical decisions. They threatened legal action, work slowdowns, everything in their playbook. The committee stood firm and released their full report publicly. The community read it and saw detailed analysis explaining exactly why the force was unjustified. They saw an oversight process that actually worked. The pressure on the department became overwhelming. Eventually, the chief implemented the committee's recommendations. The officer received a suspension and mandatory retraining. More importantly, the incident led to policy changes about when tasing was appropriate. The teenager's family, who'd been considering a lawsuit, accepted an apology and settlement after seeing the committee take their concerns seriously. Judge Brennan watched all of this unfold from her chambers. She'd returned to the bench 6 months after the settlement, assigned to a different jurisdiction to avoid any appearance of bias in cases involving the department. Her colleagues treated her with a mixture of respect and awkwardness. Some admired what she'd done. Others thought she'd made their jobs harder by putting herself in the story rather than staying above it. She didn't care about their opinions. She'd done what needed to be done. 2 years after her arrest, Judge Brennan was invited to speak at a national conference on criminal justice reform. She accepted. Her speech focused on something most people didn't want to acknowledge. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. It was designed to give enormous discretion to officers with minimal accountability. It was designed to protect law enforcement from consequences. It was designed to make it nearly impossible for victims to prove misconduct. Her arrest hadn't been an aberration. It was the system functioning normally. The only unusual part was that she had the knowledge and resources to fight back. She spoke about the dozens of people she'd sentenced over the years for resisting arrest or obstruction, wondering now how many of those arrests started exactly like hers did. She talked about the defendants who tried to explain they'd done nothing wrong, that the officer had no reason to stop them. She dismissed those claims as everyone did, assuming the officer must have had justification that simply wasn't articulated well in the report. Now she knew better. Those defendants might have been telling the truth. They might have been arrested for the same reason she was. For existing while black in a space where someone with a badge decided they didn't belong. The speech went viral. Conservative outlets attacked her for being anti-police. Progressive outlets celebrated her for speaking truth to power. She ignored both. She wasn't interested in being a symbol or a spokesperson. She was interested in results, in making sure the settlement terms were actually implemented and not just performed for show. 3 years post-arrest, the data started coming in. The department's stop patterns had shifted measurably. Officers were stopping fewer people overall, but those stops were more likely to result in actual enforcement action, suggesting they were better targeted. Complaints about discriminatory stops had dropped by 40%. Use of force incidents were down. The Oversight Committee had investigated 32 cases and found misconduct in 11 of them. Every single one of those findings led to discipline that stuck. The changes were working, but they were fragile. A new mayor could defund the committee. A new police chief could stop enforcing the policies. The union could negotiate away the reforms in the next contract. Judge Brennan understood this wasn't a permanent victory. It was a temporary shift that would require constant vigilance to maintain. That vigilance came from unexpected places. Community groups that formed during the controversy remained active, monitoring police interactions and documenting patterns. Law students volunteered to help people file complaints and navigate the process. Local journalists kept investigating, kept asking questions, kept holding officials accountable when they tried to backslide. Officer Vincent Hayes never fully recovered professionally. He left the department 18 months after the settlement, citing the hostile work environment created by what he called political interference in policing. He took a job 3 counties over as a deputy sheriff. Within 6 months there, he'd racked up 2 excessive force complaints. The pattern followed him because the pattern was him. Some people never learn. They just move. Judge Brennan saw him one more time, purely by chance. She was having coffee at a cafe when he walked in, wearing his new uniform. Their eyes met across the room. He looked away first, grabbed his order, and left quickly. She wondered if he felt anything. Shame, anger, regret? Or if he'd convinced himself he was the real victim in all this. The financial cost of that arrest kept adding up in ways the city hadn't anticipated. The settlement was just the beginning. Insurance premiums for the police department increased dramatically. The city had to hire additional staff to manage the oversight committee. Training costs multiplied. Legal fees for defending other cases piled up as more people came forward with complaints, emboldened by Brennan's successful lawsuit. One city council member tried to calculate the total cost during a budget hearing. Between the settlement, legal fees, increased insurance, new positions, training programs, and lost productivity from officers on leave, the arrest had cost taxpayers somewhere between $3 and $4 million. $4 million because one officer couldn't handle being questioned by a black woman. But the human cost was harder to quantify. Judge Brennan dealt with symptoms that lingered long after the physical injuries healed. She'd be driving and see a police car behind her, and her heart would race. She'd be in court, and an officer would approach too quickly, and she'd feel her body tense. She started therapy 6 months after the arrest, something she'd resisted initially because she thought she could handle it herself. The therapist helped her understand that what she experienced was trauma, and trauma doesn't respond to logic or willpower. Her brain had learned that police officers were dangerous, and no amount of knowing better intellectually could override that learned response. It took time, practice, and patience to retrain those reactions. Her family struggled too. Her sister became hypervigilant about police interactions, pulling out her phone to record whenever she saw officers talking to anyone. Her nephew, 15 years old, developed intense anxiety about driving once he got his learner's permit. He'd witnessed his aunt's arrest on video and internalized the message that even doing everything right wouldn't protect him. Judge Brennan tried to shield them from her worst moments, but families share pain whether they want to or not. Her mother, 73 years old, told her she'd stopped watching the news because every police shooting, every wrongful arrest, every video of violence made her think of what could have happened that night. What nearly did happen. The broader community felt the ripple effects as well. Trust between residents and police, already fragile, deteriorated further. People stopped calling for help with minor issues, afraid any interaction might escalate. Neighborhood watch programs dissolved because nobody wanted to work with officers anymore. The police blamed activists and the media for poisoning community relations. They never seemed to consider that their own actions might be the actual poison. 4 years after her arrest, Judge Brennan was assigned a case that brought everything full circle. A young man, 26 years old, was charged with resisting arrest and assaulting an officer. The police report claimed he'd attacked them during a routine stop. The defense attorney presented body cam footage showing something completely different. The young man had asked why he was being stopped, and the officers escalated immediately, grabbing him when he didn't comply fast enough with contradictory commands. Judge Brennan watched the footage 3 times. She saw herself in that young man's confusion, his attempts to understand what was happening, his fear as the situation spiraled. The similarities were impossible to ignore. The defense attorney moved to dismiss based on lack of probable cause for the initial stop. The prosecutor argued the officers had reasonable suspicion based on the defendant matching a description. What description? Judge Brennan asked. The prosecutor pulled out the dispatch call. Black male, 20s to 30s, medium build, dark clothing. Judge Brennan looked at the defendant. She looked at the prosecutor. She asked if the prosecutor seriously believed that description justified stopping this specific person. The prosecutor hesitated, then fell back on officer discretion and training. Judge Brennan suppressed evidence obtained after the unlawful stop, which gutted the prosecution's case. She dismissed the charges entirely. The young man cried when she explained he was free to go. His mother, sitting in the gallery, sobbed with relief. The prosecutor looked furious but said nothing. What could they say? The law was clear, even if it was rarely applied this way. After court, the young man's attorney thanked Judge Brennan. She didn't want thanks. She wanted a system where judges didn't have to be personally victimized before they understood what defendants had been saying all along. She wanted prosecutors who cared about justice more than conviction rates. She wanted officers who saw people as people, not threats to be controlled. But wanting and having are different things. The case got attention because of Judge Brennan's involvement. Legal analysts debated whether her personal experience created bias that should have required recusal. Others argued her experience gave her insight that made her better equipped to evaluate these cases fairly. The State Judicial Ethics Board received complaints but found no violation. Judges aren't required to recuse themselves just because they have relevant life experience. Still, Judge Brennan knew some people would always question her rulings in police misconduct cases. They'd assume she was biased against officers, unable to be objective. The irony was thick. Nobody questioned whether judges who were former prosecutors were biased in favor of police. Nobody suggested judges who came from law enforcement families should recuse themselves. But a judge who'd been unlawfully arrested? Suddenly, objectivity was a concern. 5 years after that parking lot encounter, Judge Brennan received a letter. It came to her chambers, handwritten on lined paper. The return address was from a prison 2 states away. She almost threw it away without reading it, assuming it was from an inmate asking for help with their case. Something made her open it anyway. The letter was from Vincent Hayes. He was writing from prison, serving a 4-year sentence for assault. He'd beaten a suspect during an arrest at his new department, and this time, there were multiple witnesses and clear video. This time, he couldn't talk his way out. The letter wasn't an apology exactly. It was more of an explanation, a rambling attempt to justify his actions by talking about the stress of the job, the dangers officers face, the split-second decisions required. Judge Brennan read it twice, looking for any hint of genuine remorse or understanding. She found none. Even from prison, Hayes was defending himself, portraying his violence as unfortunate but understandable. He ended the letter by saying he hoped she'd forgiven him and moved on with her life. She burned the letter in her office fireplace. Some things don't deserve preservation. That same year, the Oversight Committee released its 5-year report. The data showed measurable improvement in nearly every category. Stops were down, but more legally justified. Complaints were down. Use of force was down. Officer discipline was actually happening when misconduct was proven. The report concluded that civilian oversight, combined with mandatory training and real consequences, could change police culture. But the report also noted the fragility of these gains. Reforms required constant maintenance and political will. Without continued pressure and attention, departments would drift back toward old patterns. The work was never finished. Judge Brennan knew this better than anyone. Her arrest had sparked change, but sustaining that change required effort from countless people doing unglamorous work. Filing complaints, attending committee meetings, analyzing data, training officers, investigating misconduct, holding officials accountable. Change wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was 1,000 small actions repeated over time. She thought about that often when people asked if her arrest was worth it, if the settlement and reforms justified what she went through. The question bothered her because it assumed her trauma was a price paid for progress, as if the universe required Black women to be brutalized before society would pay attention. Her arrest shouldn't have been necessary. None of it should have happened. And the fact that it took a federal judge being unlawfully arrested on camera before the system responded proved exactly how broken things were. Ordinary people had been saying the same things for decades, but their voices didn't matter until someone with power and credentials experienced it personally. That was the real injustice. Not just what happened to her, but what had been happening to countless others who didn't have her resources or platform. People who were arrested, beaten, or killed, and nobody cared because they didn't have the right credentials or connections. People whose complaints were dismissed, whose videos were ignored, whose lives were destroyed by officers who faced no consequences. Judge Brennan returned to that parking lot once, 6 years after the arrest. She sat in her car and looked at the spot where Hayes had thrown her to the ground. The pavement had been repaved since then. No physical evidence remained of what happened there. But she remembered every second. The shock, the pain, the rage, the fear. She remembered knowing that her life could end right there, over nothing, and nobody would be held accountable. She started her car and drove away. The past couldn't be changed, but the future remained unwritten. And she'd spend whatever time she had making sure that parking lot encounter meant something beyond her own pain. Making sure the reforms survived. Making sure other people didn't have to go through what she did before the system listened. Because if there was any purpose to be found in trauma, it was in preventing others from experiencing the same thing. That was the only justice that mattered. That's the weight of 31 minutes in handcuffs. A federal judge arrested for pumping gas while black. An officer so convinced of his own assumptions that he ignored every piece of evidence contradicting them. A system so broken that it took someone with power being victimized before anyone paid attention. The reforms are real but fragile. The Oversight Committee still functions, still investigates, still holds officers accountable. But every budget cycle brings new threats to defund it. Every election brings politicians promising to get tough on crime by getting soft on police accountability. The work continues because it has to, not because it's finished. Officer Kovac never worked in law enforcement again. Judge Brennan still serves on the federal bench. Those facts alone don't constitute justice, but they're a start. Real justice would be a system where federal judges and ordinary citizens receive the same protection from unlawful arrests. Real justice would be officers facing consequences before someone with credentials and connections forces the issue. The gas station still operates on that corner. People pump gas there every day, unaware they're standing where a federal judge was handcuffed for asking questions. The cameras still record, the lights still shine, and somewhere, someone else is being stopped for matching a description that's really just code for their skin color. The body cam footage from that night remains sealed per the settlement agreement. But everyone involved knows what it shows. An officer seeing what he expected to see instead of what was actually there. A judge maintaining composure while her rights were violated. 31 minutes that cost millions of dollars and changed an entire department's policies. That's the price of assumptions. That's the cost of unchecked authority. And that's what happens when someone finally has the power to make the system answer for what it's been doing all along. Now, watching footage like this, it can really stick with you, right? Some of these clips stay in your head, especially late at night when you're trying to fall asleep. And speaking of sleep, a lot of you have told me you're waking up at 2 or 3 a.m. and just lying there. Can't shut your mind off. And the next day you're dragging through everything. I came across a simple 21-day sleep guide that's helped thousands of people fix exactly that. No pills, no apps, no gadgets. Just a step-by-step plan that actually works. It's only $15. I put the link in the description if you want to check it out. All right, I'll catch you in the next one.
Step out of the vehicle now! I don't care about your excuses!
Officer, please state the reason for this stop. I am asking for your probable cause.
I know what you're trying to do! You think your title protects you? You think I won't put you in cuffs?
I am a federal judge. You are violating my rights.
The dashboard camera clicked on at 11:47 p.m., capturing the moment that would end a 23-year police career in less than 15 minutes. Officer Kyle Brennan had no idea the woman in the silver Mercedes he just pulled over was about to become his worst nightmare. She wasn't drunk, she wasn't speeding, she hadn't broken any law. But she was black, driving through an affluent neighborhood, and in Brennan's mind, that was reason enough. Judge Simone Harper had spent the evening at a charity gala for the Children's Legal Defense Fund, an event she attended every year. She'd had exactly 1 glass of champagne during the cocktail hour, hours ago. She was wearing an elegant navy dress, pearl earrings her mother had given her, and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from 20 years on the federal bench. She was 2 miles from her home when she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. Her first thought was confusion. She checked her speedometer. 32 in a 35 zone. Turn signals had been used. She hadn't drifted lanes or done anything remotely questionable. She pulled over smoothly, put the car in park, and placed both hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. Force of habit from a lifetime of knowing that black skin and traffic stops can be a deadly combination. Brennan approached the driver's side window with his flashlight already drawn, shining it directly into Simone's face before she could even lower the window. The light was blinding, intentionally aggressive. When she finally got the window down, he was already speaking in that particular tone cops use when they've decided you're guilty of something. "Step out of the vehicle. I need you to step out right now." Simone kept her voice level and professional. "Officer, can you tell me why you pulled me over?" The question seemed to irritate him. "I said step out of the vehicle. Don't make me repeat myself." This is where most people would comply. Fear does that. Authority does that. But Simone Harper wasn't most people. She'd prosecuted corrupt officials, presided over constitutional challenges, and defended civil liberties in courtrooms across the country. She knew exactly what was happening here. "I'm asking you a simple question. What is the reason for this stop?" Brennan's jaw tightened. His hand moved to his belt, hovering near his weapon in a gesture designed to intimidate. "I smell alcohol. You're swerving. I have probable cause for a DUI investigation. Now get out of the car before I remove you myself." Every word was a lie, and they both knew it. The dashboard camera would later show Simone's vehicle never swerved once. The distance between them made smelling anything impossible. There was no probable cause, no reasonable suspicion, nothing but a black woman in an expensive car and a cop who couldn't tolerate that image in his neighborhood. Simone did something extraordinary then. She started documenting everything out loud. "Officer, for the record, I have not been drinking, beyond 1 glass of champagne approximately 4 hours ago. I was not speeding or swerving. I'm asking you again to state your probable cause for this stop, as is my constitutional right." The mention of constitutional rights seemed to flip a switch in Brennan. That's when he went from aggressive to dangerous. He yanked the door open before Simone could react. His hands grabbed her arm, pulling her from the vehicle with force completely disproportionate to the situation. Simone stumbled in her heels, catching herself against the car. She didn't resist. She didn't fight back. She simply continued speaking clearly. "I am not resisting. I am complying under protest. You are using excessive force for a traffic stop without stated probable cause." Brennan spun her around, pressing her against the hood of her own car. The metal was cold through her dress. He grabbed her wrists, pulling them behind her back with unnecessary roughness. The handcuffs clicked shut, tight enough to hurt. "You've got a real attitude problem, you know that? Think you're better than everyone else? Think the law doesn't apply to you?" Simone turned her head slightly, enough to make eye contact. The calm in her voice never wavered. "I'm a federal judge for the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals. My name is Simone Harper. You are violating my civil rights and falsely detaining me without cause. I suggest you call your supervisor immediately." For exactly 3 seconds, Brennan froze. His face went through a sequence of emotions that the dashboard camera captured in perfect detail. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something that looked like panic, then anger covering the panic. "Sure you are. And I'm the president. Let me guess, you're also a doctor and an astronaut?" He actually laughed. Not nervous laughter, but genuine mockery. He'd decided this was some kind of con, a sophisticated lie from someone trying to talk their way out of a DUI. In his mind, federal judges didn't look like the woman handcuffed against this Mercedes. Federal judges certainly didn't drive through his neighborhood at midnight. What Brennan didn't know was that Simone Harper had been appointed to the federal bench by a unanimous Senate confirmation. She'd argued cases before the Supreme Court. She'd written landmark opinions on Fourth Amendment rights that were taught in every law school in the country. She literally wrote the legal precedent on unlawful stops and searches. "Check my credentials. They're in my purse. My identification is in my wallet. My judicial ID is in the front pocket. 5 minutes of verification will confirm everything I'm telling you. Brennan pulled her away from the car instead, walking her toward his patrol vehicle. I'll check whatever I want after we do the field sobriety test. You're going to blow into a breathalyzer, and we'll see how federal you really are. The sarcasm dripped from every word. He genuinely believed he was dealing with an imposter, someone using a fake title to intimidate him. The alternative, that he'd just assaulted a sitting federal judge without cause, was too catastrophic for his mind to accept. Simone stood under the streetlight, hands cuffed behind her back, and made a decision. She stopped talking. Not because she was afraid, but because she understood something Brennan didn't. Every second of this encounter was being recorded. Every illegal action, every rights violation, every false statement was being preserved in digital clarity. Words wouldn't save her now. The evidence would. Brennan retrieved his breathalyzer from the patrol car, the cheap roadside version that defense attorneys love to challenge in court. He held it up like a trophy, smirking as he approached. "Open your mouth. Let's see what the federal judge blows." Simone complied. She breathed into the device steadily, maintaining eye contact the entire time. The machine beeped. Brennan looked at the display. His smirk disappeared. 0.00. Completely sober. Not even a trace of alcohol in her system. The champagne from 4 hours ago had metabolized completely. Brennan stared at the device like it had betrayed him, then made it worse. Machine must be broken. We'll do a blood test at the station. That's when Simone spoke again, and her voice carried weight that made even Brennan hesitate. "Officer Brennan, your name is on your badge. This dashboard camera has recorded everything from the moment you pulled me over without cause. The breathalyzer shows I'm completely sober. You have no probable cause, no evidence of impairment, and no legal justification for this stop or detention. You are now compounding your violations by refusing to release me despite exculpatory evidence. I'm giving you one final opportunity to end this before it destroys your career." The words hung in the night air. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A car drove past, the driver slowing to look at the scene. Brennan's radio crackled with dispatcher traffic about a domestic disturbance 3 blocks away. He should have released her right then. Any reasonable officer would have recognized the situation was spiraling beyond control. But Brennan had gone too far to back down now. Pride, ego, and something uglier kept him committed to the path he'd chosen. "Get in the car. You're going to the station for a blood draw and booking for DUI and resisting arrest." Simone didn't argue anymore. She let him put her in the back seat of the patrol car, the plastic seat cold and uncomfortable. She sat perfectly still as he drove, watching the streets pass by, already thinking 3 steps ahead. What Brennan didn't realize during that 12-minute drive was that Simone's phone, still in her purse in her Mercedes, had been on a call the entire time. She'd activated the voice dial feature when she first saw the lights, calling her clerk's emergency line. Every word of the encounter had been transmitted and recorded on a separate device beyond Brennan's control. The station was quiet when they arrived, just after midnight. A few officers milling around, paperwork being filed, the usual late shift routine. Brennan walked Simone inside like he'd just caught a major criminal, chest puffed out, confident in his actions. The desk sergeant looked up from his computer, saw the woman in the elegant dress and handcuffs, and something in his expression shifted. The sergeant's nameplate read Kowalski, and his eyes moved from Simone's face to her designer dress, then to Brennan with a question forming on his lips. "What's the charge?" "DUI and resisting arrest. She refused field sobriety tests and was uncooperative throughout the stop." Kowalski's eyebrows went up. "The breathalyzer?" 0.0. Machine's defective. I'm requesting a blood draw." Something in that exchange made Kowalski stand up from his chair. He walked around the desk, moving slowly, studying Simone with the kind of attention that comes from years of experience, recognizing when something doesn't add up. "Ma'am, what's your name?" "Judge Simone Harper. I serve in the Federal District Court, Southern Division. I was pulled over without cause approximately 30 minutes ago while driving home from a colleague's retirement dinner. I submitted to a breathalyzer, which confirmed I'm completely sober. Officer Brennan has refused to release me despite having zero evidence of any violation. The station went quiet. Every officer within earshot stopped what they were doing. Pens froze mid-signature. Conversations died mid-sentence. Someone dropped a coffee cup, the ceramic shattering against the tile floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Kowalski's face went pale. He looked at Brennan like someone had just told him his partner had brought a live grenade into the building. "You arrested a federal judge?" "She's lying. Probably stolen the identification. Criminals do it all the time." But Kowalski was already moving to the computer, fingers flying across the keyboard. He pulled up the federal court website, navigated to the judges section, and there she was. Photograph, biography, appointment history. Appointed by the president 3 years ago. Previously served as assistant U.S. attorney for 8 years. Harvard Law, top of her class. Recipient of numerous legal awards and commendations. Kowalski turned his monitor so Brennan could see it. "That's her." Brennan stared at the screen. For the first time since the traffic stop, genuine fear flickered across his face. But it lasted only a moment before the defiance returned. "Doesn't matter who she is, she still broke the law." "What law?" Kowalski's voice had an edge now. "What did she do?" "She was swerving, driving erratically. Your dash cam will show that?" Brennan hesitated. "It should." "It should? Or it does?" Kowalski was already pulling up the patrol car footage. The system was networked, automatically uploading video to the department's servers. He found Brennan's car, located the timestamp, and pressed play. Everyone in the station gathered around. They watched Simone's Mercedes maintaining perfect lane discipline. They watched it signal properly before changing lanes. They watched it stop completely at a stop sign, wait the appropriate time, then proceed. They watched Brennan's patrol car follow for 8 blocks without the Mercedes doing anything remotely resembling erratic driving. Then they watched Brennan hit his lights. Kowalski stopped the video. He looked at Brennan with an expression that combined disbelief and fury. "Where's the swerving?" "It was before I started recording. Your camera activates automatically when you leave the parking lot. We both know that. The system has glitches. Convenient." Kowalski turned to another officer. "Get Lieutenant Vasquez down here right now." While they waited, Kowalski removed Simone's handcuffs himself, apologizing with every word. The other officers kept their distance, none of them wanting any connection to what was unfolding. They'd all seen careers end before, but this had the potential to be spectacularly destructive. Lieutenant Carmen Vasquez arrived within minutes, her uniform hastily straightened, clearly having been woken from sleep. She listened to Kowalski's summary, watched the dashcam footage, and her jaw tightened with each passing second. When the video ended, she turned to Brennan with barely controlled rage. "My office. Now." What happened in that office over the next 40 minutes would become the subject of internal affairs reports, legal depositions, and eventually federal court testimony. Brennan tried to justify his actions. He claimed he'd made an honest mistake, that the judge had been suspicious, that her refusal to comply had given him no choice. Vasquez tore apart every excuse with surgical precision. "You had no probable cause for the stop. Your own camera proves that. You conducted field sobriety tests on someone who clearly wasn't impaired. You arrested a federal judge after a breathalyzer confirmed she was sober. You falsified the reason for the stop. You ignored exculpatory evidence. You made false statements to your desk sergeant." Every sentence was a nail in Brennan's career coffin. Meanwhile, Simone sat in the station waiting area, declining offers of coffee or water, simply sitting with perfect posture while officers avoided eye contact. One younger officer, barely out of the academy, approached nervously. "Ma'am, I just want to say I'm sorry this happened. That shouldn't have happened to anyone, especially not to you." Simone's expression softened slightly. What's your name, officer? Taylor, ma'am. Officer Melissa Taylor. How long have you been on the force, Officer Taylor? 6 months. Let me give you some advice that will serve you well. When you see something wrong, don't participate in it. Don't enable it. Don't look away from it. What happened tonight didn't start with the traffic stop. It started with years of similar stops that nobody questioned, nobody reported, nobody challenged. Be better than that. Taylor nodded, the lesson sinking in, before retreating to her desk. When Vasquez finally emerged from her office, Brennan followed behind her, his badge and weapon already surrendered. She walked directly to Simone. Judge Harper, Officer Brennan has been suspended pending a full internal affairs investigation. The department will be conducting a comprehensive review of his arrest record and body camera footage. We will cooperate fully with any legal action you choose to pursue. On behalf of the department, I apologize for this egregious violation of your rights. Simone stood, gathering her composure. Lieutenant, I want copies of all documentation related to tonight's incident. The dashcam footage, the breathalyzer results, the arrest report, booking photos, everything. I also want a list of every traffic stop Officer Brennan has conducted in the past 3 years, with particular attention to demographic data. Vasquez didn't hesitate. You'll have everything by end of business tomorrow. And Lieutenant, I want to know how many complaints have been filed against Officer Brennan and how they were resolved. The question hung in the air because everyone in that station already knew the answer. Multiple complaints had been filed over the years, all dismissed, all marked as unfounded or unsubstantiated. The pattern had been there all along, visible to anyone who cared to look. Nobody had looked. A patrol car drove Simone back to her Mercedes, still sitting on that dark street corner where this nightmare began. Her phone showed 43 missed calls. The recording of the entire encounter was saved and backed up. She sat in her car for a long moment, hands on the steering wheel, processing everything that had happened. Tomorrow, she would file formal complaints with the police department, the state attorney general, and the FBI's Civil Rights Division. She would document every detail while it remained fresh. She would use her position and her knowledge of the system to ensure this wasn't buried or dismissed. But tonight, she just wanted to go home. The drive took 15 minutes. Her house was dark and quiet. She walked inside, kicked off her heels, and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had occurred. The violation, the humiliation, the rage. But mostly, she thought about all the people this had happened to who weren't federal judges, who didn't know their rights, who didn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back, who ended up with criminal records, lost jobs, damaged lives. All because of officers like Brennan, who saw certain people as inherently suspicious, inherently criminal. The next morning started early. Simone's phone rang at 6:30, with her clerk calling to confirm she'd heard the recording and asking what needed to be done. By 7, Simone was composing a formal complaint. By 8, she was on a conference call with the FBI's Civil Rights Division. By 9, the story had leaked to the press. Local news picked it up first. Federal judge arrested in questionable DUI stop. Then regional outlets. Then national. By noon, footage that didn't come from the police dashcam began circulating online. A resident whose house faced that intersection had a security camera that captured the entire traffic stop. The video showed everything. Simone's calm compliance, Brennan's aggressive escalation, the lack of any impairment. The footage went viral within hours, viewed millions of times. Public reaction was swift and fierce. The police chief held a press conference that same afternoon. He stood behind a podium bearing the department's seal, looking visibly uncomfortable as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. Chief Raymond spoke in carefully measured tones about how they took these allegations seriously and had immediately placed Officer Brennan on administrative leave pending a full investigation. He emphasized their commitment to professional standards and community trust. The words rang hollow to anyone who'd watched the security footage. Standing in her chambers the next morning, Simone reviewed the documents that had been delivered as promised. The file on Officer Brennan was thicker than she'd anticipated. 17 complaints over 5 years. 17. Each one dismissed with variations of the same justification. Complainant uncooperative. Insufficient evidence. Officer acted within policy guidelines. She spread the reports across her desk, studying the pattern that emerged. 12 of the 17 complainants were people of color. 14 were stopped for minor traffic violations that escalated dramatically. 8 mentioned being called aggressive or threatening despite remaining calm. The pattern wasn't subtle. It was a neon sign that everyone had ignored. Her phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number. Judge Reeves, you don't know me, but Officer Brennan arrested me 2 years ago. Same thing happened to me. DUI charge. Failed sobriety test I never actually failed. Night in jail. I couldn't afford a good lawyer. Took a plea deal because I was terrified. Lost my job anyway. Thank you for fighting back. More messages followed throughout the day. Different numbers, similar stories. A teacher who spent 12 hours in custody. A nurse who missed her shift and got written up. A college student whose scholarship was jeopardized by an arrest record. A father who couldn't pick up his kids from school because he was being processed on bogus charges. Each story a variation on the same theme. Brennan saw what he wanted to see, manufactured evidence to support his assumptions, and the system protected him every single time. The FBI investigation moved faster than typical federal inquiries. Special Agent Victoria Lynn arrived at Simone's office 3 days after the incident, carrying a briefcase and a recorder. She was direct and thorough, spending 4 hours going through every detail of that night. What were you wearing? What time did the stop occur? Describe his exact words. How long between the field sobriety test and the breathalyzer? Did he give you the opportunity to request a blood test? Simone answered everything precisely, her legal training making her an exceptionally credible witness. She also handed over something the agent hadn't expected, a flash drive containing audio recordings from 6 other individuals who'd contacted her with similar experiences involving Brennan. All had agreed to speak with federal investigators. All wanted their stories on record. Agent Lynn's expression shifted as she reviewed the files. This isn't just one bad stop. This is systemic. We're looking at civil rights violations, false arrest, possible evidence tampering? If even half of these accounts are accurate, Officer Brennan has been operating with impunity for years. Simone leaned forward. The question isn't whether the accounts are accurate. The question is, how many complaints have to be filed before someone actually investigates? 17 complaints, Agent Lynn. 17 times someone said this officer violated their rights, and 17 times the department found nothing wrong. That's not oversight failure. That's intentional blindness. The local news cycle exploded. Investigative reporters started digging into Brennan's record, finding the same pattern Simone had identified. They interviewed people who'd been too afraid to come forward before. Citizens who thought no one would believe them against a police officer's word. A restaurant manager described being pulled over while driving home from closing. A graphic designer talked about being stopped 3 times in 6 months. Always released without charges, but always treated like a criminal. A high school counselor recounted an incident where Brennan searched her car for 30 minutes, convinced he'd find drugs, finding nothing but becoming angry when she asked for his badge number. The police union issued a statement defending Brennan. Officer Brennan has served this community with distinction for over a decade. These allegations are part of a coordinated attack on law enforcement. We stand behind our officer and trust the investigation will clear his name. He has the right to due process, just like any citizen. The statement was technically correct about due process, but missed the irony entirely. Brennan had denied that same due process to countless people over the years, assuming guilt and manufacturing grounds for arrest. Public pressure mounted. Community groups organized protests outside the police station. The local NAACP chapter called for Brennan's termination and a comprehensive review of the department's internal affairs procedures. City council members who'd previously stayed silent suddenly had strong opinions about accountability and reform. The mayor, facing re-election in 8 months, announced the formation of a civilian review board to examine police conduct. Simone knew political theater when she saw it, but she also understood that public attention created opportunities for actual change. 2 weeks after her arrest, the district attorney's office made an announcement. All charges against Judge Simone Reeves were being dropped with prejudice, meaning they could never be refiled. Additionally, the DA was launching a review of every case where Officer Brennan had been the arresting officer in the past 5 years. If evidence of misconduct was found, those cases would be eligible for review and potential dismissal. The decision affected hundreds of cases. Public defenders who'd watched their clients plead guilty to charges they swore were fabricated suddenly had grounds to reopen those matters. People with criminal records stemming from Brennan's arrests could petition for expungement. The ripple effects would take years to fully process. Officer Brennan's attorney released his own statement. "My client maintains his innocence and looks forward to his day in court. He followed proper procedure during a routine traffic stop. The accusations against him are unfounded and motivated by anti-police sentiment. He's being made a scapegoat for larger societal issues he had no part in creating." But the evidence kept mounting. The FBI discovered that Brennan had filed reports claiming drug dogs alerted on vehicles when no canine unit had been present. He documented field sobriety tests showing impairment in cases where dashcam footage showed suspects performing flawlessly. He'd claimed suspects were aggressive or threatening in situations where video showed calm compliance. The lies weren't occasional mistakes. They were standard practice. 3 weeks in, a breaking development shifted everything. A former officer from the same precinct came forward as a whistleblower. His name was Thomas Garrett, recently retired after 28 years on the force. He contacted Agent Lynn directly and provided testimony that Brennan wasn't acting alone. According to Garrett, a group of officers had an informal competition, tracking who could make the most arrests each month. They called it the stat game. Promotions and preferred assignments went to officers with high numbers, creating incentive to manufacture arrests from routine stops. Garrett had complained to supervisors multiple times over the years. Each time, he was told to focus on his own work and stop causing problems. When he persisted, he was reassigned to less desirable shifts and passed over for advancement. He eventually stopped complaining and started counting days until retirement. Now, with pension secured and nothing left to lose, he was ready to testify about everything he'd witnessed. His testimony was devastating. He described watching Brennan and 3 other officers coordinate stories after questionable stops. He recalled supervisors coaching officers on how to write reports that would withstand scrutiny, teaching them which phrases justified searches and arrests. He provided names, dates, specific incidents. The FBI investigation expanded immediately, now targeting multiple officers and several supervisors. The department's command structure was implicated in what appeared to be institutional tolerance of civil rights violations. This wasn't a few bad apples. This was a corrupted barrel. Simone received a call from the police chief requesting a private meeting. She agreed, curious what he could possibly say at this point. They met in a neutral location, a conference room at the courthouse. Chief Raymond looked exhausted, his face drawn and eyes shadowed. "Judge Reeves, I want to apologize personally, not as chief, but as someone who failed in his responsibility to ensure his officers operated with integrity. I should have seen this. The signs were there." Simone's expression remained neutral. "Chief Raymond, with respect, you did see this. 17 complaints against one officer, multiple complaints against others, former officers trying to report misconduct. You didn't fail to see it. You chose to ignore it because addressing it would have been difficult and uncomfortable." "There's a difference." He nodded slowly, accepting the rebuke. "You're right, and I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I'm here to tell you that I'm implementing immediate changes. Mandatory body cameras for all officers, activated during every citizen interaction. Independent review of all use of force incidents. Revised training protocols emphasizing de-escalation. A genuine civilian oversight board with subpoena power. These changes should have happened years ago, but they're happening now. Simone studied him carefully. Those are good steps, Chief. But policies mean nothing without enforcement and accountability. The real question is whether officers who violate those policies will face actual consequences, or whether the system will continue protecting them. The chief had no answer to that, because they both knew the answer depended on factors beyond his control. Culture, politics, union contracts, qualified immunity, the blue wall of silence. Changing policy was easy. Changing culture was the hard part. Officer Brennan's trial began 6 months after his arrest. The courtroom was packed with media, activists, community members, and off-duty officers showing support for their colleague. Simone sat in the gallery, watching quietly as prosecutors presented their case. The evidence was overwhelming. Body camera footage showed Brennan planting drugs during traffic stops on 3 separate occasions. Dashboard camera footage from his patrol car captured him coaching his partner on how to justify searches that had no legal basis. Text messages revealed conversations about quotas and the stat game that former Officer Garrett had described. But the most damaging testimony came from victims. 7 people took the stand to describe their encounters with Brennan. A college student arrested for possession after Brennan planted a baggie during a routine speeding stop. A single mother who lost custody of her children after a fabricated drug arrest led to child services involvement. A man who spent 14 months in jail awaiting trial for charges that were eventually dismissed when surveillance footage contradicted Brennan's reports. Each testimony painted the same picture: an officer who viewed citizens, particularly citizens of color, as targets rather than people deserving protection. Someone who manufactured crimes to boost his statistics, advance his career, and satisfy supervisors demanding results. The defense strategy was predictable. They attacked the credibility of witnesses, suggested video evidence was taken out of context, and portrayed Brennan as a dedicated officer who made difficult, split-second decisions in dangerous situations. They brought character witnesses, fellow officers who testified about Brennan's professionalism and dedication. But the jury wasn't buying it. After just 9 hours of deliberation, they returned guilty verdicts on all counts: conspiracy to violate civil rights, falsification of evidence, perjury, deprivation of rights under color of law. Brennan showed no emotion as the verdicts were read. His wife sobbed quietly in the front row. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. Federal guidelines suggested 12 to 15 years. The prosecution asked for the maximum, arguing that Brennan had betrayed his oath and destroyed lives for personal advancement. The defense begged for leniency, highlighting his years of service and previously clean record. The judge, a woman named Elena Vasquez, who had spent 20 years on the federal bench, delivered a scathing statement before announcing the sentence. Officer Brennan, you were entrusted with extraordinary power. The power to detain, to search, to arrest, to use force. That power exists because society trusts that officers will exercise it responsibly and lawfully. You violated that trust repeatedly and deliberately. You manufactured evidence, lied under oath, and destroyed lives to advance your career. The harm you caused is immeasurable. Families separated, reputations destroyed, years of freedom stolen. And for what? Better performance reviews? Preferred assignments? Your actions didn't just harm your victims. They harmed every honest officer who does this job with integrity. They harmed community trust in law enforcement. They harmed the justice system itself. Judge Vasquez sentenced Brennan to 18 years in federal prison, 3 years above the guideline maximum. The courtroom erupted. Officers in attendance stood and walked out in protest. Community members applauded until Vasquez gavelled them into silence. Brennan's wife collapsed into her attorney's arms. But Brennan wasn't the only one facing consequences. The 3 other officers implicated in the stat game were indicted on similar charges. 2 took plea deals, agreeing to testify against supervisors in exchange for reduced sentences. The 3rd chose to fight and lost, receiving a 14-year sentence after trial. 4 supervisors were also charged. They faced counts of conspiracy and obstruction for their roles in encouraging and covering up misconduct. The trials revealed a systematic effort to boost arrest numbers regardless of legality. Supervisors had created informal reward systems, offering preferred shifts and overtime opportunities to officers with high statistics. They had coached officers on report writing, teaching them phrases that would justify legally questionable stops and searches. During one supervisor's trial, prosecutors presented an internal training document titled Effective Report Writing for Court Viability. The document explicitly instructed officers to use specific language in reports to overcome legal challenges. It suggested phrases like furtive movements and appeared nervous that could justify searches. It advised officers to always include statements about detecting odors of marijuana or observing suspicious bulges that might indicate weapons. The document was devastating evidence of institutional corruption. It proved supervisors weren't just tolerating misconduct, they were actively training officers to circumvent constitutional protections. All 4 supervisors were convicted. Sentences ranged from 8 to 12 years. The police chief who had met with Simone announced his resignation the day after the final verdict, though he faced no criminal charges. His resignation letter contained no apology, just vague statements about allowing new leadership to guide the department forward. The civil cases moved forward simultaneously. Simone's lawsuit expanded into a class action representing 43 people who had been arrested by Brennan and the other implicated officers. The city fought initially, denying systemic problems and claiming the convicted officers were anomalies. But discovery revealed otherwise. Internal affairs records showed hundreds of complaints over a 10-year period that were dismissed or inadequately investigated. Performance evaluations explicitly rewarded officers for high arrest numbers, without any quality control to ensure those arrests were legitimate. Training materials emphasized enforcement over community relations. Faced with overwhelming evidence, the city agreed to settle. The total payout exceeded $30 million, distributed among class members based on the severity of harm they'd suffered. People who had been arrested but not charged received smaller amounts. Those who had been charged received more. People who had served jail time or lost jobs and housing received the largest settlements. Simone's portion was substantial, though she donated most of it to organizations working on criminal justice reform. Money couldn't undo what happened, couldn't restore the 2 years of her life spent fighting charges that should never have existed. But it could fund work to prevent others from experiencing the same nightmare. The consent decree imposed on the department was comprehensive. Mandatory body cameras with severe penalties for officers who failed to activate them. Independent investigation of all use of force incidents. Revised training emphasizing constitutional rights and de-escalation. A civilian oversight board with genuine authority to investigate complaints and recommend discipline. Annual audits of arrest patterns to identify potential racial bias. Implementation was rocky. The police union challenged several provisions, arguing they interfered with officer safety and operational flexibility. Some officers left the department rather than work under new restrictions. Others continued operating as they always had, betting that enforcement of new policies would be inconsistent. But slowly, measurably, things began to change. Complaints decreased, use of force incidents dropped, community surveys showed incremental improvement in trust. It wasn't transformation, but it was movement in the right direction. Simone returned to her life, though fundamentally altered. She changed careers, leaving corporate work to attend law school. She graduated 3 years later and joined a nonprofit legal organization representing people in situations similar to hers. She became an expert on police misconduct litigation and testified before legislative committees about needed reforms. She never forgot what happened in that parking lot. The feeling of handcuffs, the humiliation of being arrested in front of neighbors, the terror of facing prison for something she didn't do. Those memories fueled her work, driving her to fight for others who lacked resources or knowledge to fight for themselves. 8 years after her arrest, Simone received an unexpected letter. It was from Brennan, writing from federal prison. The letter was brief. He didn't apologize. He didn't claim innocence. He simply stated that he'd had time to think about his actions and the people he'd harmed. He said he understood why she couldn't forgive him. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He just wanted her to know that he thought about what he'd done, and he was sorry. Simone read the letter twice, then filed it away. She didn't respond. Some wounds don't heal with apologies, especially ones that come after consequence rather than conscience. Brennan's regret, if genuine, was his to carry. What mattered more was ensuring the system that enabled him was dismantled, that future officers understood the badge wasn't a license for abuse, that communities had mechanisms to hold police accountable, that people like her, standing in parking lots minding their own business, didn't become casualties of someone else's ambition. The fight wasn't over. Systems don't change because of one lawsuit or one trial. But every verdict, every settlement, every policy reform added weight to the scale. Justice wasn't a destination. It was constant pressure applied in the right direction. Simone thought about that night often, the feeling of cold metal against her wrists, the humiliation of standing handcuffed while neighbors watched, the calculated cruelty in Brennan's voice when he mocked her credentials. Those memories never fully faded, but they transformed into something else. Fuel. She used them every time she walked into a courtroom representing someone who'd been railroaded by officers who thought badges made them untouchable. Every time she testified before legislators about qualified immunity and accountability. Every time she trained young lawyers on civil rights litigation. The night that nearly destroyed her life became the foundation for work that would protect thousands of others. The system that enabled Brennan didn't disappear overnight. Culture change moves slower than policy change. But the consent decree forced into place after the trials created cracks in the wall. Body cameras became mandatory. Civilian oversight gained real teeth. Officers started understanding that their actions had consequences beyond internal review boards designed to protect them. Years later, walking through that same neighborhood where everything happened, Simone would sometimes drive past the intersection where Brennan pulled her over. The street looked exactly the same. Same houses, same streetlights, same stop sign. But everything had changed beneath the surface. The department operated differently. Officers thought twice before manufacturing probable cause. Communities had mechanisms to fight back. Perfect? No. Better? Measurably. That's what justice looks like in the real world. Not dramatic courtroom moments or tearful apologies, just incremental pressure applied consistently over time until the corrupt foundation cracks and something stronger gets built in its place. Brennan sat in a federal prison cell thinking about what he'd lost. The officers who followed his example faced their own consequences. The supervisors who enabled them learned that looking away had a price. And Simone Harper, the woman who refused to be silent in that parking lot, became the architect of reforms that would outlast everyone involved. Because the real victory wasn't one verdict or one settlement. It was changing the calculation, making officers understand that the next person they harass might be someone who fights back, someone who knows their rights, someone who has the resources and knowledge to burn their career to the ground. That fear, that uncertainty, that accountability creates the space where actual justice becomes possible. Now, watching footage like this, it can really stick with you, right? Some of these clips stay in your head, especially late at night when you're trying to fall asleep.
Don't start lying to me. We know your type uses fake names to hide.
My name is Judge Angelique Jones.
You have no warrant.
Yeah, and I'm supposed to believe that?
You think that title protects you?
You're violating the law.
At 6:49 a.m., inside a private recovery room at St. Clement's Medical Center, two ICE agents in full tactical gear forced open the door and walked in on a black woman lying in a hospital bed. The woman was Judge Angelique Jones, 54, a sitting United States Federal District Court judge for the Eastern District of Virginia. She had undergone emergency surgery just 14 hours earlier. She was connected to an IV drip, a heart monitor, and a post-operative drainage tube. She could not stand. She could barely lift her arms. The lead agent, Vincent Graff, walked straight to the bed and grabbed her wrist. His partner, Samuel Denton, stood at the foot of the bed and demanded identification. Neither agent had a warrant. Neither had verified who was in the room. Neither had spoken to a single doctor or nurse before entering. The hospital security camera in the hallway captured both of them walking in. The body camera mounted on Graff's chest was recording, and what it would capture over the next several minutes would trigger a federal investigation, end multiple careers, and become one of the most viewed clips of law enforcement abuse in the country. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because the next story is one you absolutely do not want to miss. To understand how outrageous this moment truly was, you need to know who was lying in that hospital bed. Judge Angelique Jones was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and raised by a single mother named Eileen, who cleaned office buildings at night so her daughter could attend school during the day. Angelique graduated top of her class at Howard University, then earned her law degree from Yale, where she made law review. She clerked for a United States Supreme Court justice, spent 8 years as a federal prosecutor handling civil rights cases, then moved into private litigation, where she spent 6 more years representing victims of unlawful detention and government overreach. When the president nominated her to the federal bench, the Senate confirmed her 94-6. She was known for her sharp legal mind, her fairness to both sides, and her unflinching willingness to hold law enforcement accountable when they violated the Constitution. In the 18 months before that hospital room door was forced open, Judge Jones had ruled against unlawful ICE detentions 3 separate times, ordering the release of detained immigrants, and issuing written opinions that called out what she described as a pattern of constitutional indifference within the agency. She was deeply respected in the legal community. She was also deeply resented by certain agencies who did not appreciate being told they had to follow the law. And on that morning, lying in a hospital gown with surgical tubes still in her body, she became the target of the very kind of abuse she had spent her entire career fighting against. Agent Vincent Graff was 42 years old and had been with Immigration and Customs Enforcement for 16 years. He had built a reputation inside the agency as someone who got results. But the way he got those results had left a trail of damage that his supervisors chose to ignore. Over the past 9 years, 11 formal complaints had been filed against Graff by detained individuals alleging excessive force, verbal abuse, and racial targeting. Every single one had been reviewed internally and dismissed. Colleagues described him as someone who doesn't ask twice. That phrase was meant as a compliment inside certain circles of the agency. What it really meant was that Graff used intimidation as a first resort, force as a second, and paperwork as a way to clean up whatever mess came after. His partner, Agent Samuel Denton, was 36 years old with 8 years on the job. Denton was a follower. He deferred to Graff on every call, every decision, every confrontation. He didn't challenge, he didn't question. He watched and he complied. On 2 prior occasions, Denton had stood by while Graff escalated the use of force against detained individuals. Both incidents were caught on surveillance footage. Both were buried by supervisors who decided the complaints weren't worth pursuing. Together, Graff and Denton had been dispatched to St. Clement's Medical Center based on a single anonymous tip. The caller claimed that an undocumented woman was recovering at the hospital under a false identity. The tip included a room number. No one at the field office verified the tip. No one checked hospital records. No one contacted the facility. No one obtained a warrant. The room number belonged to Judge Angelique Jones. Graff pushed the door open without knocking. Denton followed a step behind. The room was dim, the blinds still drawn, the only light coming from the glow of the heart monitor and the IV pump beside the bed. Judge Jones lay under a thin hospital blanket, her gown visible at the collar, tubes running from her arm and her side. She was groggy from pain medication administered just 2 hours earlier. Her eyes opened slowly as the door swung wide and 2 men in tactical vests stepped inside. Graff didn't wait. He announced that they were federal agents with ICE and demanded she identify herself. Jones blinked, her mind working through the fog of medication. She said her name. She said she was a federal judge. Graff looked at Denton and let out a short laugh. Sure you are. He told Denton to check the bed and her personal items. Denton moved to the side of the room and began going through her overnight bag, pulling out clothing, toiletries, and a book. Her judicial credentials, her federal ID, and her personal phone were inside a locked drawer built into the bedside table. Graff pointed at it. Open that. Jones's voice was strained but clear. No, I don't consent to a search. You don't have a warrant. Graff leaned closer. You don't have rights right now. You have instructions. The heart monitor began to spike. The beeping quickened, filling the small room with a rhythm that matched the rising tension. Out in the hallway, a nurse heard raised voices coming from a room that was supposed to be quiet. A room that held a post-surgical patient who was not supposed to be disturbed for any reason. She turned and started walking toward the door. The door opened and Nurse Priscilla Duval stepped inside. Duval was 58 years old and had worked at St. Clement's for 28 years. She had seen families fall apart in these rooms. She had held the hands of patients who didn't make it through the night. She had never once allowed anyone to compromise the safety of someone in her care, and she was not about to start now. She looked at the 2 agents standing over her patient and spoke immediately. You need to stop. This woman is a post-surgical patient. She cannot be disturbed, moved, or agitated. She is under medical supervision, and I need you to step away from the bed right now. Graff turned to face her. His expression didn't change. Leave the room. This is a federal matter. Duval didn't move. I'm not going anywhere. I'm calling hospital security and the attending physician. You are not authorized to be in here. Graff took a step toward her. Interfering with a federal operation is a crime. You can be arrested right here, right now. Do you understand that? Duval met his eyes and did not flinch. Then arrest me. But you are not touching my patient again until someone with legal authority tells me otherwise. Denton shifted his position and moved to block the doorway, standing with his arms folded across his chest. Behind him, the hallway was still and quiet. But not for long. From the bed, Judge Jones's voice cut through the tension. It was strained from pain, but steady and deliberate. I am a United States Federal District Court judge. You are in my hospital room without a warrant. You are violating my Fourth Amendment rights. Leave immediately. Graff didn't even look at her. He reached toward her wrist, pulling a zip tie from his belt. The moment his hand closed around her arm and pulled, Jones gasped. The movement sent a sharp jolt through her surgical site. Her body tensed, her face twisted. The heart monitor screamed. The alarm filled the room with a high-pitched, continuous tone that carried through the open doorway and down the corridor. Within seconds, footsteps were coming from every direction. Medical staff were running. Doctor! Solomon Osai came through the door at a pace that made Denton step aside before he could think about it. Osai was the attending surgeon who had operated on Judge Jones the night before. He was tall, composed, and not a man who raised his voice unless the situation demanded it. This situation demanded it. He moved directly between Graff and the bed and placed himself there like a wall. Do not touch my patient again. If you put your hands on her one more time, I will call 911 and this hospital's legal department at the same time, and you will explain to both of them why a post-surgical woman is being physically handled by 2 men with no medical authority and no warrant. Graff opened his mouth to respond, but Osai was not finished. Step back. Now. 2 hospital security guards appeared in the doorway, both breathing hard from the sprint down the corridor. One of them spoke immediately. Do you have a warrant? Show us a warrant or identify your legal authority to be in this room.
Graf straightened. We don't need a warrant. We're acting on credible intelligence regarding an undocumented individual in this facility. Dr. Osei shook his head slowly. This woman is Judge Angelique Jones. She has been my patient for 2 years. She is a United States citizen. She is a federal judge. And you are standing in her recovery room harassing her after major surgery. For the first time since entering the room, Graf hesitated. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved from Osei to the security guards to Duval and then back to the bed where Jones lay with tears running down her face, one hand pressing against her surgical site. Denton leaned in and whispered, "We need to go." Graf shook his head. "We need to confirm her story." He pulled his radio from his vest and keyed the channel, calling his field office for verification. While he waited for a response, he looked at Denton and gave a short nod toward the door. "Stand there. Nobody in or out until I get confirmation." Denton moved to the doorway and planted himself. A sitting United States Federal District Court judge was now being physically detained in her own hospital bed by 2 ICE agents who had no warrant, no verified intelligence, and no legal ground to stand on. The hallway security camera recorded every second. Patients in neighboring rooms stood in their doorways watching. Staff members lined the corridor, and the body camera on Vincent Graf's chest kept blinking red, capturing everything from his own perspective, building the evidence that would eventually destroy him. While Graf stood at the foot of the bed waiting for his field office to respond, the hospital's chief administrator was 3 floors up making a phone call that would change the course of everything. The administrator had been briefed by security within minutes of the alarm going off. When she heard the words, "federal judge," she didn't call the police. She didn't call ICE. She called the United States Marshals Service, the agency specifically responsible for the protection of federal judges. Within 12 minutes, Deputy U.S. Marshal Franklin Yates was on the phone with the hospital. He confirmed Judge Jones was assigned to the Eastern District of Virginia. He confirmed she was a sitting Article III judge. He confirmed there was no active warrant, no detainer, no federal order of any kind associated with her name. Within 20 minutes, 2 marshals walked through the front entrance of St. Clement's Medical Center, badges displayed, sidearms holstered, and moved directly to the 3rd-floor recovery wing. When they entered the room, Graf was still standing at the foot of Jones's bed. Denton was still blocking the doorway. Dr. Osei was still positioned between Graf and his patient. The heart monitor was still beeping faster than it should have been. Marshal Yates stepped forward and identified himself. He looked at Judge Jones, asked her to confirm her name, her title, and her district. She did. The verification took less than 90 seconds. Then Yates turned to Graf. His voice was calm and controlled, but every word carried weight. "You are standing in the hospital room of a sitting Article III federal judge, without a warrant, after physically touching her against her will. Do you understand what you've done?" Graf's mouth opened. He started to speak. He mentioned the anonymous tip. He said his field office had dispatched them. He said they were following protocol. Yates cut him off. "Step into the hallway. Now." Denton moved immediately. He dropped his arms, stepped out of the doorway, and stood against the corridor wall without a word. Graf lingered. He looked at the marshals, then at Dr. Osei, then at Jones. Then he turned and walked out. The marshals secured the room. Nurse Duval returned to the bedside. Judge Jones was shaking. Her face was wet with tears. Her hand was pressed against her side where the surgical site had been pulled during the struggle. A dark stain was beginning to spread beneath the bandage. Dr. Osei leaned over her and looked at the wound. He straightened and called for an emergency wound reevaluation. The bleeding had started again. Within the hour, the hospital moved with a precision that matched the severity of what had just happened. The chief administrator issued a legal hold on all security footage from the 3rd-floor recovery wing, the hallway cameras, the entrance lobby, and the elevator corridors. Every frame, from every angle, was preserved and locked. No one could access, edit, or delete a single second of it without authorization from the hospital's legal counsel.
The U.S. Marshals flagged the body camera footage from Graff's chest unit for immediate federal preservation. A formal request was sent to ICE's Evidence Management Division, demanding the footage be secured and copied before anyone in Graff's chain of command could review or alter it. Nurse Priscilla Duval sat down at the nursing station and wrote a detailed incident report. She documented the time the agents entered, what they said, how they spoke to her patient, the threat Graff made against her personally, and the moment he grabbed Judge Jones's wrist hard enough to cause her to cry out and trigger the heart monitor alarm. She signed it and submitted it to hospital administration before her shift ended. Dr. Osei documented everything from the medical side: the reopened surgical wound, the elevated heart rate, the spike in blood pressure, the trauma response visible in a patient who had been stable and resting just 1 hour before the agents forced their way in. He noted that the physical confrontation had set back her recovery and introduced a risk of infection at the surgical site. 3 other patients on the floor provided witness statements. One described hearing a woman crying and a man yelling. Another described 2 men in tactical gear blocking a doorway while nurses tried to get through. A third said she heard someone say the words, "You're hurting me," and that the voice sounded weak, like someone who could barely speak. But the piece of evidence that would travel the farthest didn't come from a hospital camera or a body cam. A janitor named Terrence Hollis had been mopping the hallway outside Judge Jones's room when the agents entered. When the voices got loud, he pulled out his phone and hit record. The video was 40 seconds long. It showed Graff through the open doorway gripping Judge Jones's wrist while she lay in the bed. Her voice was audible. "You're hurting me. I just had surgery." The clip was shaky and the angle was narrow, but the image was clear enough and the words were loud enough to leave no room for doubt. That 40-second video would eventually reach millions of views and become the single most watched piece of footage from the entire case. The U.S. Marshals didn't wait. Before Judge Jones's wound had even been rebandaged, a formal notification was sent to the Department of Justice in Washington. The report was flagged urgent. It described the warrantless entry into a hospital room, the physical detention of a sitting Article III federal judge, the use of force against a post-surgical patient, and the presence of body camera footage and multiple witnesses. Within hours, the DOJ's Office of Professional Responsibility opened a preliminary inquiry. The file was assigned priority status, and a team of federal investigators was designated to handle it. That same afternoon, the Chief Judge of the Eastern District of Virginia was personally briefed by phone. He listened without interruption. When the briefing was finished, he issued an internal memo to the entire court system. The language was direct and unsparing. He called the incident a fundamental violation of judicial independence and constitutional protection, and stated that the physical assault and detention of a federal judge in a medical facility by agents operating without legal authority represented a direct threat to the functioning of the judiciary itself. The Federal Judges Association, a body that rarely made public statements, released one that evening. It expressed what it called grave alarm at the reported physical detention of a sitting federal judge without a warrant, without probable cause, and without any legal basis. Congressional offices began receiving calls from constituents, advocacy groups, and legal organizations. By evening, cable news had picked up the janitor's phone video. The 40-second clip played on loop across every major network. The image of a woman in a hospital bed saying, "You're hurting me," while a man in tactical gear gripped her wrist was impossible to explain away. Impossible to spin. Impossible to ignore. ICE headquarters in Washington scrambled. A public affairs team drafted a statement saying the agency was aware of the incident and was reviewing the circumstances. Internally, the tone was very different. Senior officials were furious, not at what had happened to Judge Jones, but at the exposure. The anonymous tip that had triggered the entire operation was traced within days. It had come from a burner phone. The number had no registered owner. Investigators quickly began to suspect the tip was retaliatory. Just 6 weeks earlier, Judge Jones had issued a ruling ordering the release of 14 detained asylum seekers after finding that ICE had held them in violation of due process. Her written opinion had included a line that had circulated widely within the agency
and had made her no friends. She had described what she called a pattern of constitutional indifference embedded in the agency's enforcement culture. Someone, investigators believed, had decided to make her pay for those words, and they had used a phone with no name attached to do it. Federal investigators received the full body camera footage from Graff's chest unit 3 days after the incident. The file was 22 minutes long. It was reviewed in a secure room at the DOJ by a team of attorneys and civil rights investigators. What they saw was devastating. The footage began in the hospital corridor. Graff and Denton walked side by side toward the room. Just before reaching the door, Graff leaned slightly toward Denton and spoke in a lowered voice. The body camera microphone picked it up clearly. Another one, using a fake name. These people always have a story. Investigators paused the footage and replayed that line 4 times. They flagged the phrase, "these people," and marked the timestamp. The footage continued. Graff pushed the door open without knocking. The camera captured the dim room, the monitors, the IV stand, and Judge Jones lying in the bed, eyes barely open. Graff announced himself and demanded identification. Jones responded. She gave her name. She said she was a federal judge. The camera recorded Graff's reaction. The short laugh, the words, "Sure you are," spoken with a dismissiveness that would be replayed in courtrooms and on television for months. The footage showed Denton going through her overnight bag. It showed Graff ordering her to unlock the bedside drawer. It captured her refusal and his response. "You don't have rights right now. You have instructions." It captured Nurse Duval entering the room and telling them to stop. It captured Graff threatening to arrest her for interfering with a federal operation. It captured the moment Graff reached for Judge Jones's wrist with the zip tie, the gasp of pain, the sharp movement that pulled at her surgical wound, and the heart monitor alarm that followed. It captured Dr. Osei entering and positioning himself between the agent and the bed. It captured Graff refusing to leave. It captured him ordering Denton to guard the door. And it captured the arrival of the U.S. Marshals, the verification of Jones's identity, and Marshal Yates telling Graff exactly what he had done. Every second of it was recorded by Graff's own equipment, from his own perspective, in high definition with clear audio. Investigators cross-referenced the footage with ICE's internal dispatch records. What they found deepened the case significantly. Over the previous 4 years, Graff had been involved in 94 field operations. Of those, 78 had targeted Black or Latino individuals. The pattern was overwhelming and consistent. Taken together with the whispered comment before entering the room, it painted a picture of racial bias that was not incidental, but systematic. The footage and the dispatch records were compiled into a sealed evidence package and shared with the DOJ's Civil Rights Division. The investigation was no longer just about what happened in one hospital room. It was about how long it had been allowed to happen everywhere else. ICE moved fast, but not fast enough to stay ahead of the damage. Within 48 hours, both Graff and Denton were placed on immediate, unpaid suspension. Their credentials were confiscated, their firearms were collected, their access to federal systems was revoked. But the fallout didn't stop with the 2 agents. It climbed upward. Investigators pulled the internal dispatch log and found the name of the man who had approved the operation. Agent in charge, Rodney Sloan, 51, a field supervisor with 19 years at ICE, had received the anonymous tip, logged it, and authorized the hospital entry. He did not verify the tip. He did not request a warrant. He did not contact the hospital. He did not run a basic check on the room's occupant, a step that would have taken less than 5 minutes and would have immediately revealed that the patient was a sitting federal judge. Sloan was suspended the same week, but what investigators found next was worse. Every one of Graff's 11 prior complaints had been reviewed and closed at the supervisory level. Every single closure had been signed by Rodney Sloan. For 9 years, Sloan had personally ensured that no complaint against Graff ever moved beyond his desk. Excessive force, verbal abuse, racial targeting, all of it filed and dismissed by the same man who had just sent Graff into a federal judge's hospital room
without a warrant. 3 additional supervisors who had co-signed complaint closures were placed under formal review. ICE's Office of Professional Responsibility opened a full internal investigation spanning 5 years of Graff's operations. Every case, every arrest, every closed complaint was reopened. In a rare move, the union that represented ICE agents publicly distanced itself from Graff, issuing a statement saying it could not defend actions that clearly fell outside the bounds of lawful conduct. The collapse was no longer about one hospital room. It was pulling apart an entire chain of command. Judge Jones was discharged from St. Clement's 8 days after the incident. Her recovery had been set back by the reopened wound and the trauma of what happened in her room. 2 days after returning home, she released a written statement. It was measured, precise, and devastating. She described being woken from a medicated sleep by 2 armed men who did not identify themselves. She described the confusion of opening her eyes to tactical vests and raised voices, while her body was still connected to monitors and tubes. She described being told she did not have rights. She described the moment an agent grabbed her wrist and pulled, and the pain that followed as her surgical wound tore. Then she wrote the line that would be quoted everywhere. I have spent my career upholding the Constitution from the bench. I never imagined I would have to invoke it from a hospital bed to protect my own body. She confirmed she would cooperate fully with the DOJ investigation and that she was weighing civil action. Legal scholars noted that assaulting a sitting federal judge could constitute a federal crime under statutes protecting judicial officers from interference and physical harm. Civil rights organizations called it one of the most egregious abuses of federal law enforcement power in recent memory. The NAACP called it racial profiling taken to its most extreme conclusion. And across the country, millions of people watched the janitor's 40-second video one more time and saw a black woman in a hospital bed telling a man in a tactical vest that he was hurting her. The Department of Justice announced the charges on a Tuesday morning. Vincent Graff was charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, assault of a federal official, and unlawful entry and detention without a warrant. Samuel Denton was charged with aiding the deprivation of rights and failure to intervene. Rodney Sloan was charged with supervisory negligence resulting in civil rights violations and obstruction of justice for his role in systematically burying complaints against Graff over a period of 9 years. All 3 were formally terminated from ICE the same day. Their federal law enforcement credentials were permanently revoked. Their badges, firearms, and agency identification were surrendered. Graff's attorney moved quickly, filing motions to dismiss the charges. His central argument was that the anonymous tip had provided reasonable suspicion and that Graff had acted within the scope of his duties. The federal judge reviewing the motions denied every single one. In her written ruling, she called the argument an insult to the Fourth Amendment and stated that an unverified anonymous tip directed at a hospital patient does not create reasonable suspicion, does not authorize warrantless entry, and does not give any federal agent the right to lay hands on a citizen in a recovery bed. The trial lasted 9 days. The prosecution laid out its case methodically. They played the body camera footage from start to finish. They played the hospital surveillance video showing both agents entering the corridor and Denton blocking the doorway. They played the janitor's 40-second phone recording. They entered into evidence the medical records showing the reopened surgical wound and the trauma-induced cardiac event triggered by the confrontation. Nurse Duval took the stand and described what she saw when she entered that room. Dr. Osei testified about the physical damage caused to his patient. The U.S. Marshals described what they found when they arrived. Then Graff took the stand. He insisted he was following protocol. Under cross-examination, he could not name the protocol. He could not produce a warrant. He could not explain why he ignored a federal judge identifying herself to his face. He was asked about the phrase, "these people," captured on his own body camera seconds before entering the room. He said it wasn't racial. The prosecutor asked him what it meant. He had no answer. The jury was shown the footage one final time. They deliberated for 6 hours. Graff was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 5 years and 4 months in federal prison. Denton, who had cooperated with investigators and pleaded guilty before trial, received 22 months. Sloan, whose 9-year pattern of burying complaints had enabled everything that happened in that hospital room, received 30 months for obstruction and supervisory negligence. Judge Jones filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against ICE, the Department of Homeland Security, and the individual agents involved. The case cited unlawful detention, assault of a federal official, warrantless entry, racial profiling, and deliberate indifference by supervisory personnel who had enabled years of misconduct. The evidence was so overwhelming that the government's attorneys never let it reach trial. The case settled for $4.6 million, one of the largest individual settlements in a federal civil rights case involving a judicial official. But the money was not the point. The settlement included mandated reforms that would reshape how ICE conducted operations for years to come. Independent oversight of all field operations involving hospitals and medical facilities. Mandatory warrant requirements before any agent could enter medical premises. A formal review process for all anonymous tips before action could be authorized. And a national audit of every dismissed complaint filed against ICE agents over the previous decade. Judge Jones returned to the bench 4 months after the incident. She walked into her courtroom the same way she always had, composed, prepared, and unwilling to let anyone believe she had been broken by what happened to her. Her first case back involved an immigration detention challenge. She heard the arguments, reviewed the evidence, and ruled from the bench. In her written opinion, she included a single line that was quoted on every network, in every legal journal, and across every corner of the internet where people had followed her story. No badge outranks the Constitution. Not in my courtroom, not in my hospital room, not anywhere. Back at St. Clement's Medical Center, a framed article about the case hung in the third-floor nursing station. Nurse Duval had put it there herself. The janitor's 40-second video reached 11 million views. This case was brutal, but the case on the right spirals completely out of control.
Fairness is an enduring mission, and insight serves as your safeguard. Thank you for watching and advocating for absolute clarity.